Frasier was used to James's behavior, so he didn't flinch when he heard his words. "I'd like to see you try," he replied quietly. But there was an undercurrent of malice in his voice that even James noticed. The smile on James's face froze before it disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. He couldn't understand how his brother-in-law was so calm after he had given away so much money the day before. He wasn't even upset that James was on a mission to spend it in less than 24 hours. "Do you really think that you're better than me?" asked James, pulling himself up to his full height. "I certainly know how to deal with Nick Tomlins, which is something you don't know how to do. How about I help you with them?" He waved an arm toward Hector. "Show me your best villa. I want to buy it," he said grandly, pulling his bank card out of his wallet and handing it over. The entire team of salespeople looked at him in surprise. They had finally met a man wealthy enough to buy the best villa. "Show him one in Redwood Courts," said a young salesman to Hector, hoping that his suggestion might earn him a tip. "We reserve those houses for only the most well-to-do clients." "No," said Hector. "They are nice, but I think Mr. Laplace might prefer the courtyard. It's nearer the center of the district, and it's where the celebrities are buying. They're also bigger houses." Hector was clever. He knew exactly what James wanted to hear, and he smiled inwardly when he saw James swell with pride at the suggestion. "Pearl, what do you think?" asked James, keen to look chivalrous in front of so many people. Pearl smiled. "Sounds good to me," she said. She felt as if all her dreams had come true. She couldn't believe they were actually house hunting in the most exclusive district in the city. "Very good," said James. "I'm glad that's settled. We'll look at the larger houses in the courtyard." He walked towards the door. Such was his impatience to see the properties. But he couldn't resist a backward glance at Frasier as he left. He had a smug smile on his face. "Okay then, let's go," said Hector, holding the door open for Pearl. He started rubbing his hands in glee as they passed ahead of him. The other sales staff could look on in envy. At James for his money, and at Hector for the amount of commission he was about to earn. "Wait a minute," said Frasier loudly. "What do you want now?" asked James, rolling his eyes. He looked at Hector apologetically, as if Frasier was an annoying ant on the sole of his shoe. Frasier ignored him and looked at Hector instead. "I'd heard that Riverbank was the best part of the development." Hearing the name Riverbank, James and Pearl's eyes lit up. "James, I want to live there," said Pearl excitedly. "I don't want to live in a house where the neighbors can overlook us." "All right, let's look there instead," said James. He didn't care where they lived as long as it was considered the most exclusive house in the district. "Mr. Laplace, are you sure you want to buy a private property in that part of the development? It's very exclusive." Hector was so excited that it was hard for him to breathe. "Are you saying you have another client who is more entitled to live there than me?" asked James indignantly. "Of course not," said Hector, recovering his composure as quickly as he had lost it. "I'll just find the keys. You'll definitely love the houses there. They were designed by none other than Mark Ludendorff. They're the biggest houses in the entire complex." The more James heard, the more nervous he became. Such a luxurious villa. Would he be able to afford it? Wait, he shouted, sweat forming on his brow. "Before we go and take a look, tell me how much those houses cost." "Oh, don't worry," said Hector, mistaking his worry about the cost as being a concern about the house not being expensive enough. "These are much more expensive than the houses in the courtyard or Redwood Court. You'll certainly feel right at home there." "Please, just tell me the price," said James. He was beginning to get scared. Hector told him the price. It was massively out of his budget, but he was too proud to admit it in front of both his girlfriend and a crowd of salespeople. It's, not safe to live by a river, he blustered. It might flood. I'd rather see one of the other ones you mentioned. Pearl glared at him. She knew he had nowhere near the amount Hector had mentioned, but she blushed crimson with embarrassment at how she felt James was handling the situation. Her dreams of having the grandest house in the development vanished almost as quickly as they had arrived. Hector smiled, quickly hiding his disappointment at losing such a huge commission. Don't worry, he said. I've got the keys to some lovely villas. Let's go see what you think. Once you've seen them, you'll still want to live in one. They're definitely where a respectable man like yourself would want to live. James thought about it and relaxed, glad he was about to see a house he could afford. They needed to live in a house that wasn't overlooked by the neighbors or someone like Nick Tomlin's. And besides, a respectable house with neighbors might come in handy, he thought. Just think of the business networking I could do. Yes, I'd prefer that, said James quietly. Pearl wasn't impressed, but after listening to James's reasoning, she reluctantly accepted the situation. Are you sure you can afford to buy one? She asked him rudely. Of course, said James, upset that she doubted him. How much are the houses in the courtyard? Hector cheerfully told him the prices, thinking a man like James wouldn't find them too extortionate. His smile soon faded as James and Pearl looked at him in disbelief. Is that too expensive for you? He asked, watching his huge commission slip through his fingers even more. No, of course not, said James. But the look on his face told Hector otherwise. He was wondering if James had been naive enough to come to the development without checking out the house prices on their website first. Mr. Laplace, perhaps you could tell me how much you are willing to spend, and then we could work out which houses or apartments you'd be able to afford, said Hector as politely as he could. No, don't bother, said James, his face bright red with embarrassment. He had turned up to the city's most exclusive new housing development with less than half the amount of money needed to buy even the smallest house. He looked at all the salespeople staring sadly at him and made a decision. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, he said. I've got to be on the other side of town in less than 20 minutes to discuss some business. Now, if you'll excuse me. He walked out of the office and towards his new car. James! Shouted Pearl as she ran after him. If you don't have enough money, ask your mother for more. James turned around and raised his fist. He managed to stop himself before his punch reached her face, realizing that there were nearly a dozen witnesses who would testify they saw a man punch a woman. He lowered his hand and wiped it on his clothing, trying to dry the sweat that had formed on his palm. You were the one who wanted to buy a house here, he said to her angrily. Why don't you pay for it? You were going to hit me, she said, so stunned that she couldn't even speak properly. Anger flashed through her eyes, but she managed to calm herself quickly. I was just joking. Don't be angry with me. Look, we're not in a hurry about a house. Do you want to... But he didn't get to finish his words. She blinked at him and put her finger suggestively in her mouth in a way she knew he loved. Let's go home, he said, forgetting all about buying a house. He took her hand, led her to the car, and sped off. The sports car left the parking lot, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the sound of an overpowered engine. Hector sat down, embarrassment all over his face. He had severely misjudged the man in the sports car, and everyone else in the room knew it. Turns out the man could afford a car and nothing else, he said dejectedly. If I ever meet him again, I won't be quite so polite. The room was silent. The other staff busied themselves at their desks, trying not to make him feel any worse than he already felt. They had all been there in the past. He looked at Frasier in disgust. Well, why aren't you leaving? He asked, fighting an urge to take it out on the man's brother-in-law. Could it be that you think you're richer than Mr. Laplace? Frasier looked at him. He decided not to say anything. Emma, get this man out of my sight before I call security, he said. I've had enough of his family for one day. Emma looked at him. She was in a dilemma. It wasn't in her nature to chase anyone out of the room, even if she did think that he had no intention of buying. However, if she didn't, Hector had the ability to make her life a misery. You'd better do as he says, whispered one of her colleagues. You know what he's like when he's missed a sale. Emma looked like she was about to start crying. Frasier walked over to her. Don't worry about me, he said kindly. I can look after myself. No doubt you look after that useless brother-in-law too, shouted Hector viciously. Family ties are everything to sort you out. It's all you've got to help you when you've got no money. Frasier didn't answer. He knew the man was angry and needed to vent his frustration somewhere. He just hoped he wouldn't take it out on Emma. If I'm not mistaken, that little car outside is yours, right? Said Hector. Congratulations. You are not mistaken, said Frasier, trying to sound jolly. Why? He asked, his eyes turning cold. Hector laughed. I bet you've got over 100,000 miles on that rust bucket, he said. You can't afford a car like Mr. Laplace, yet you're standing in my office thinking about buying a house in the Santa Ana complex. Emma, get him out. Emma stood rooted to the spot, torn between a colleague and a customer. She couldn't bear to see how everyone appeared to treat him. Mr. Macklemore, how about... Frasier raised his hand, interrupting her words. He looked at Hector. Is this how you treat your customers at the Santa Ana complex? Do I need to ask for your manager? You? Said Hector, trying not to laugh. You think you can get me fired? Do you honestly think the manager will take you seriously? I'm the top performing salesperson in this office. There's no way in the world he's gonna fire me. Is that really what you think? Asked Frasier, beginning to lose his temper. Would you like to bet on it? I'm more than happy to bring your boss into this and get you fired. Nothing would make me happier than to see Emma take all your commissions from now on. Mr. Macklemore, pleaded Emma. He's our best performing salesperson. The manager will never fire him. Please, stop. Frasier turned to her and handed her his bank card. Don't worry. He won't bully you anymore. I'd like a private villa, please. The room went silent. Did he just ask for a private villa? Whispered one salesman to his colleague. I'm sure I didn't hear him right. I think it's a mistake, his colleague whispered in reply. If he can't afford a fancy car, there's no way in the world he can afford a private villa. You don't need to do this, said Emma. It's way too much money to spend just to prove a point with Hector. Go and do it, ordered Frasier. He had turned back to Hector and stared at him. He knew there was no other way he would get respect from this man. The only thing he knew was money, and Frasier would teach him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Which villa did you have in mind? Asked Emma. The one designed by Mark Ludendorff, said Frasier, still looking at Hector. He wanted to be sure it was a villa in which Natalia would enjoy spending time. She liked privacy. Emma sighed. She took the bank card and put it in the machine. Convinced that the card would be declined, she thought about what alternative jobs she could find in the area once her manager found out about this and fired her. Hector would settle for nothing less, she decided. I'd be very surprised if that transaction goes through, said Hector, starting to enjoy himself. It's been approved, said Emma quietly, not believing the card-reading machine. Hector looked at her sharply. Funny joke, he said. Pack your bag. You'll be jobless in less than an hour. No, said Emma, a little louder this time. It really has gone through. She looked at Frasier and smiled, genuinely pleased for him. Each and every salesperson in the room jumped up and ran to the card reading machine, wanting to see for themselves that the transaction really had gone through. Even Hector, who pushed past some of the team's younger members, looked at the screen in disbelief. He had lost the bet. I think this is a trick, he said, determined not to be beaten. I'm not lying to you, said Emma. Mr. Macklemore really has bought the Ludendorff house. Hector looked at her. He tried to see if she was lying, but the unbridled joy on her face let him know that he had lost. He looked back at the screen to see the transfer take place. He counted the zeros as the money moved from one bank account to the other, his face close to tears. Give that machine to me, he snapped. It must be broken. As he tried to snatch the machine off Emma, Frasier grabbed his arms, his lightning-quick reactions startling everyone. He looked at Hector, a cold smile on his lips. No, it's not, he said, tightening his grip on the man's arm. You've just got to learn when you're beaten. He's right, Hector, said one of the older salespeople. He owns that home now. Even if you complain to the manager, he's not going to listen to you. He turned to Frasier. May I get you a coffee? He asked politely. Frasier let go of Hector's arm. Yes, thank you, he said. Hector watched as everyone in the room began to show Frasier acts of courtesy and respect. He finally had to admit he was beaten. He walked over to the comfortable chair that someone had found for Frasier to sit on. The same person offered his hand. Congratulations, Mr. Macklemore, he said as politely as he could manage. You've bought yourself a wonderful home. I would like to admit my mistake and apologize for it. If there's anything I can do for you, please don't hesitate to let me know. Frasier looked at him. Would you have forgiven me if I'd lost the bet? No, said Hector. Then let me give you some advice, said Frasier, his voice cold. You need to stop throwing your weight around. You need to treat others with more respect, and you've got to stop assuming you're the most knowledgeable person in the room. I hope you've learned your lesson. Emma returned with some papers for him to sign. They went through the formalities in silence. Hector returned to his desk and didn't utter another word. He watched furiously as his colleagues celebrated the biggest sale they had ever made. Emma had made a fine commission that day. Frasier collected the keys and jumped into his car. He was late to collect Natalia from work. When he got to the office, she was waiting for him outside. She got into his car and glared at him. You're late, she said. Sorry, was all that he said in reply. 20 minutes later, they arrived back at her parents' home. As they got out of the car, they were struck by the sound of wailing from inside the house. Natalia ran to the door, worried they had been burgled. But as she walked in, she learned that was not the case.
Hey guys, Frasier here. Listen to the full episode of Unraveling the Son-In-Law exclusively on Pocket FM app. Click the link in description to install the app now.